Hello, and welcome to the ATPE podcast, brought to you by the Association of Texas Professional Educators and covering the hottest topics on Texas educators' minds today.
Hello, and welcome to the ATPE podcast. My name is David George, and I serve as editor for ATPE News Magazine. Today, we're going to discuss the upcoming runoff election. Specifically, we'll be looking at when you can vote, where the elections are taking place, and why it's so important for Texas educators. We're excited to be joined by ATPE Governmental Relations Director Monty Exter. Thank you for being here, Monty.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Following a disappointing Texas primary election in March, it appears that the House is looking far less friendly to public education issues going forward. Some of these races have been tight, and I know you're following the runoffs closely. Can you talk to us about just how crazy the races have been?
Absolutely. It has been an election season like no other so far. We have had millions and millions of dollars poured in from out of state. And really, they've been poured into all of this false propaganda, ad after ad after ad. Many of these folks have gotten involved because of the voucher issue, but then they're not even speaking to that particular issue. They're trying to, again, they spread false propaganda about the records of the folks that they're attacking on completely unrelated issues. The thing is, though, this is true, right? With most falsehoods, after a while, that starts to wear a little bit thin and people start to see through it. And there's some evidence that that's happening. And folks are starting to recognize that these are, in fact, falsehoods, which is great. It means that support for some of our pro-public education candidates seems to be on the rise. But that only really matters if that support translates into folks showing up at the ballot. And that's something that we can't really know until the actual election starts to kick off.
So who can show up to vote in the runoff?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So obviously we had a primary in March, so I like to call that round one. And to some extent, who can show up to round two is a little bit based on round one. So, for example, let's just take Gary Van Dever's race. Gary Van Dever, he's up in Northeast Texas. He's a Republican, so obviously he was in the Republican primary in March. So if you voted in the Republican primary in March, you can absolutely come back out and vote in the Republican primary runoff here in May. But that's not the only folks that can vote. If you didn't vote in March at all, then, and this would be obviously statewide, like you can come out and you can vote really in either primary if you have a Democratic, runoff in May, if you've got a Republican runoff in May. So let's go back to that Gary Van Dever example. Let's say that you voted in the Democratic primary in March. Those would be the only folks, which in his particular district is literally a handful of folks, that would not be eligible to vote for him in this upcoming runoff election. So to quickly break it down again, if you voted in round one, you can vote again in round two for the same party you voted for in round one. You can't vote for the opposite party in round two that you voted for in round one. But if you didn't vote in round one at all, you can vote for anybody. You're a free agent. You are eligible to show up, and we need you to show up during this upcoming runoff election.
We know that there's no immediate teacher pay raise or voucher legislation on the runoff ballots. So why is voting so important for educators right now?
Well, those issues may not be directly on the ballot, but those issues are determined by the Texas legislature, and the Texas legislature is what's on the ballot. So that's one reason why it's really important to turn out, because you have to have a favorable legislature to get favorable legislation, and that seems pretty straightforward, right? But in addition to that, turnout is also something that our politicians, particularly state leaders, really look at. And it doesn't necessarily mean turnout to the point that your side necessarily wins the election. I'll go back all the way to 2018. So before we passed House Bill 3, we had a big election. The cycle before that, right? We had stuff like the bathroom bill going on. It was a terrible legislative season for public education. Parents and educators both got really fed up, and they showed up in huge numbers to the polls. Despite the fact that folks like the lieutenant governor still won their races, it was tight. And they could also see that turnout had spiked up, and that influenced their behavior during the next legislative cycle. So during this last, legislature, we talked about vouchers the entire time. We had a governor who refused to prioritize public education spending, including teacher pay raises, despite the fact that we had a huge surplus. The money was there. So what needs to happen now for them to understand that was a big deal that they didn't do it is for folks to turn out. Even though the governor's not on the ballot this time, that doesn't matter. If they can see that the parts of the electorate that care about those issues turned out in significantly greater numbers than they did the season before that, that's going to influence their activity in this next upcoming legislature.
So voter turnout is the key to getting legislators to listen and to take these education issues seriously. In the just released issue of ATPE News Magazine, the Your Voice column presented educators with the maxim, "You must be present to win." What does that mean exactly?
Right. So part of the reason why we've used that phrase, right, is because it is a phrase that is deeply embedded in the culture of ATPE with all of our meetings. And while at ATPE, perhaps you must be present at the meeting to win the door prize, it is also true and greatly more important that you must be present at the ballot box to win the election and to win the prizes associated with that election. Pay raises, funding, better supports for you and your students in your classroom. All good things or bad things can flow from the Texas legislature when it comes to education. And only those folks who actually take the time to go to the polls really get the ear of our state politicians. Whether that's because they have elected somebody or unelected somebody, or just that they've shown them that they're engaged and they're going to show up. Because just like the last answer, just showing up has a psychological impact whether or not your person actually prevails. But that said, if enough folks show up, your person will prevail, and that'll be an even bigger impact.
May 28th. That's the big day for the runoff election. You can early vote the 20th through the 24th. What are some areas where important elections are being held for our pro-public education friendly legislators?
Yeah, absolutely. So I already mentioned one. Up in the Northeast Texas area, we've got Gary Van Dever's runoff going on. We also have some runoffs around the DFW area. So if you live in Rockwall County or in the southern part of Collin County, that's a really important area. If you live sort of in and around Cleburne, there's another runoff going there in House District 58. If you are in House District 44, which is the Seguin, New Braunfels, Church-Cibolo, and then all the way out into Gonzales County, that area also is a really important runoff for education issues. Now, there are other runoffs that are around the state as well. And so, and even in those, right? So I said the southern part of Collin County. Well, when does that stop being the southern part? So the best thing that you can actually do is go to Teach the Vote, go to our candidate page, put your address in, hit submit, and then it'll tell you what your House district is, and it'll show you. So if you've got more than one person in either the D or the R column in your House races, when those pop up, you've got a runoff. So that's probably the best, surest way to know is just to visit Teach the Vote. And while you're there, you can check out those candidates that pop up and see which one of them you might want to vote for.
So the issues that teachers face are statewide, but not everybody tuning in lives in a runoff district, how can those that aren't getting a chance to speak their mind at the ballot box later this month have an opportunity to help fight for public education?
Absolutely. There are a number of ways, really. So first of all, it always amazes me the network that teachers have. So teachers from one part of the state absolutely know teachers from other part of the state. So you can certainly encourage your friends who are in areas where there is a runoff how important it is to take the time to get out and vote. We know that educators are super busy. They're particularly busy right now, right, as we're winding up school. And so that little extra bit of encouragement to take that, 20, 30 minutes and go to the polls and vote could make the difference between whether or not your friend actually makes it or doesn't make it to the polls. So that's one thing they can do. Another thing they can do is, participate in the ATPE PAC. That's an opportunity that only ATPE members and their families have. We utilize that to make sure that folks who are going to be with them in the legislature have a little bit more of a fighting chance during the election cycle. Those dollars come, like I said, exclusively from ATPE members. So every single person that participates in the PAC, that's going to be a little bit better of a legislature that you have moving forward.
You mentioned Teach to Vote. What other resources do our ATPE members have to better educate themselves on these important educator issues?
Sure. So you've got the whole ATPE website, first of all, including certainly the advocacy tab where we've got our legislative priorities, things of that nature. You do have the blog. So Teach the Vote is more than just that candidate page, although that is certainly a very important aspect of educating yourself about the elections. It's got the blog on it as well, where we talk about those issues and talk about what's going on in education. You've got things like this podcast. We certainly try to do those. We've got the upcoming magazine coming out that has a lot about this upcoming election in it. And then we've got partner organizations like the League of Women Voters, who has Vote 411. That's a fantastic tool that folks can use to help learn a little bit more about the elections, where the polls are in their area, about some races that maybe we don't cover as much. A lot of the league, local leagues will talk a little bit more about some local school board races. They also talk about non-education issues, so you can learn a little bit more about those before you head to the ballot as well.
Monty, is there anything else that our members need to know about the upcoming runoff?
Really just to stress again how important it is that you must be present to win. It is so important that folks show up to this runoff. Turnout in primaries in general, very low. Turnout in runoffs is usually only half of what the turnout is. Turnout in round 2, half of what the turnout is in round 1. And so while it might be, 100 or so votes that might determine an election in March, we've seen it where it's like a dozen or so votes that sometimes determines an election. And really it is about normally who can get the folks that voted in round 1 back out. But like I said, with regard to educators, if you didn't vote in round 1, you can absolutely vote in round 2. And that's like a secret weapon for the pro-public education guys, because you may have been super busy during the March election, and maybe you've got a little bit more time now. So, if you and 10 of your friends come to the polls and you didn't vote in round 1, and you come and you vote for one of the good guys, you could literally swing the election for them. Not hyperbole, not joking. And so it is that important that folks take the time to get out and speak their mind in favor of themselves and their students and public education.
Monty, thank you so much for all your insight on this important topic. As always, if you have any questions or feedback, you can send those to com@atpe.org. That's COMM@atpe.org. And we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast as well as leave us a review. Thanks again for being here, and we will see you next time on the ATPE podcast.
Thanks for listening to the ATPE podcast. For more information about becoming part of Texas's largest community of educators, please visit atpe.org.